So, doctor, what if I really am attracting these negative people in my life and I listened to your last episode, but it's not enough for me? Like, I really do feel stuck. Doc, I've heard what you've said, self love and all that's jazz, but I just don't think it's that easy. I really am stuck in my relationships. I don't see a way out. I'm not getting my needs met, but at the same time, I also am. It's weird. I just know that I can't leave them. And that's too hard for me. And yet I don't feel loved. I don't ever feel like I'm going to be enough. It really feels pretty hopeless. Oof, that's a tough one. And that question comes up in my office too. And so I felt like I'd be remiss if I left you thinking that, all of these questions of do I attract these people in my life could be left to anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, or having some self-worth or insecurity as their main drivers. It's just not true. Sometimes there is a real dysregulation in the nervous system that gets us feeling trapped. That's right. Like really stuck. We're in these relationships. We know they're not good for us, but we can't seem to get out of them. And if that's you, then I want you to keep listening today because I have some really good explanation of why that's happening neurobiologically. And I want you to learn how to get out of that. Welcome. This is how to fix your sucky life. That's right. Maybe you're somebody who says, so life sucks. Now what? Right? Fix me, doc. I don't know what to do with all of this. This is a podcast that teaches anybody who's interested in learning a little bit more about how to get control of the anxiety in their life, the stress in their life, all of those feelings that are bogging you down. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Marr, a clinical psychologist of the last 2 decades and a trauma therapist. And I'm here to help you understand how things early in our life, things like trauma or really difficult times, impact us later in life, so much so that it drives us off course and into patterns that are not helping us. They don't serve us and they create suffering for us. And there's a lot of information swimming out there. So I know that people are looking to feel better and want to know what works. Why don't we help you fix that sucky life? I take all of the information from neuroscience, my experience over the last 2 decades, and all the fits and starts of my own personal life, and I put it all together in a toolbox for you so that you can stop just surviving and learn how to really thrive in your life. I know it's possible to get there, so let's get started. Welcome back. I'm so excited to be here. Now, listen, I was literally recording my first podcast and I was thinking all the way through it. So I hope you didn't pick up on this necessarily in the podcast itself, but I was thinking all the way through it. This isn't fair. This seems like I'm kind of putting this into kind of these innocuous categories where self-love is going to fix it all. Self-love fixes a ton. And other truth, self-love is hard. Effortful, hard. If you have no blueprint in your brain for that, no map of how to get there, my saying go do that just feels insensitive and invalidating. And if that was you in my last episode, I'm sorry, didn't mean that. I apologize, didn't mean to come across that way. And I'm hoping today's episode kind of redeems that a little bit because I know as a trauma therapist, there's bigger and deeper issues that really send us into these relationships sometimes. And these usually are born out of some sort of relational traumatic event. So it's not necessarily that you have a trauma disorder, right? Here's what I usually say to my clients. Everybody's had traumatic experiences in their life. Everybody. You can't get through the world without it. Hey, we all have a universal one now because we went through COVID and had our whole lives rug pulled out from underneath us, right? Everything had to change overnight, literally overnight. That's traumatic experience. So everybody's got traumatic experiences, but not everybody has a trauma disorder. That doesn't happen to all of us. And really the difference is resiliency. What are the protective factors What are the resources that I have available to me when I go through that traumatic event? If there are enough of them, I won't have a trauma response. I won't have it go into my neurobiology in such a way that it turns on that high threat response. But if, on the other hand, I don't have enough resources when the shit hits the fan, then I'm in trouble, right? So I want to talk to that group today because there's also that group, and it really deserves its own podcast. Honestly, it deserves its own graduate school course, and it deserves its own dissertations and all of the things. But more than that, I wanted to make sure that you understood that there are deeper seated reasons why we get stuck in relationships that do not serve us. Hey, let's just talk about the ones that we're related to. So there are family of origin people like sisters, brothers, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, those folks that we can't really divorce ourselves from necessarily. And if we set big boundaries, well, we've got a bunch of cultural norms and social conditioning that tells us, tisk, tisk, you should not do that. You should not, just cut those people out of your life. That makes you a bad person, not them. Okay, not true. And these are the relationships where, for sure we feel like we're stuck, right? There's all sorts of kind of cultural reasons why we stay in, and family rules why we stay in, and social conditioning that makes us stay in those relationships even when they're harming us, or at the very least not serving us. But the other relationships, the ones where we've actually put in the effort and done the work, and now we find ourselves kind of in these marriages and partnerships and friendships where they're bleeding us dry. Like we're just, like it's just draining, right? You feel like these people are emotional vampires sometimes. I know that's extreme. That's big language. And I see it out there. I see it out there in the more kind of pop culture-y psychology where we're talking about narcissists that we're dating and that we're empaths and all of these things. And I want to just speak to that kind of group, right? I'm interrupting this podcast just to thank you for listening. I really enjoy doing this, and it is my passion to make sure that people understand more about mental health and how to create emotional wellness in their life. So please like and follow me wherever you find your podcasts. And I would strongly encourage you to share an episode or two with someone close to you that you know could use this information. And if you want to learn a little bit more about what services I provide and you're in the state of Minnesota, or you're looking for consultation or coaching, which I can do outside of Minnesota, head on over to nataliemarrcounseling.com. And there you'll be able to see all the services that I provide and maybe pick up a blog or find another podcast that you want to listen to. Thank you, and keep listening. So how I see it usually in my office is somebody's coming in and they're really kind of stuck. Usually their outward presentation is one of two ways. They're hopeless and helpless and depressed. Or they're highly anxious and controlling, and they want to fix everything, and they want to figure out the solution to this, because if they could just figure out the solution to this, then it'll all get better, right? It usually kind of falls into those two camps. There's certainly people who have a little bit of both, and there are certain people that just kind of wave in and out of both. Sometimes I'm hopeless, helpless, don't have any motivation to change it, don't even want to talk about it, don't think that there's ever going to be a solution. And then sometimes I'm like amped, restless, I've got to fix this, I can't handle this anymore. What do I got to do, doc? Okay, let's talk about it. Let's unpack it. So if you come in and you really feel stuck in your relationships, you see this idea of, I am dating the same people over and over, or now I'm stuck. I definitely attracted these people in my relationship. You might even have some story that you're telling yourself about how you deserve that, or something of that nature. Then I'm really gonna want to dig in to the original event, if possible. If not, where in your lifetime, how early in your lifetime did that patterns start to arise. And here's why. And there are definite things that we know as psychologists about the different developmental stages. So say from 0 to 7 is when this, blueprint or map got imprinted in your head to kind of put up with the BS in your relationships and duck and run and be a people pleaser and have, just a real aversion to any kind of conflict. You did that between 0 and 7. I have a reasonable idea of the kinds of ways that you learn to manage it because I know how many resources are in that brain between 0 to 7. And I know that they're not much. And I know how that shows up in the autonomic nervous system. And so then you and I can unpack that a little bit differently. So let me talk about that 0 to 7 range. Let's think about 0 to 7-year-olds. I mean, you possibly know some 0 to 7-year-olds. Like, how competent are they to handle things? Let's say they've got a parent that rejects them. Maybe they're the kid that was supposed to be this gender and they ended up that gender. Or maybe they're the kid that was the oops, not came at a time that nobody really wanted them around. Maybe that kid came and then the marriage dissolved or the relationship dissolved. And so one parent is harboring some resentment at that child as being kind of the impetus for how that happened. I mean, sometimes it's just that parents are immature emotionally, like really have their own mental health issues and just aren't able to give that child what they want. And so you're going to be growing up in a household where that 0 to 7-year-old person is not getting their needs met. Well, what's a 0 to 7-year-old going to do? Well, listen, first of all, a 0 to 7-year-old doesn't even know what's going down. That's the reality of this, okay? So clearly, what happens in that particular age range is pretty clear. They don't believe that something's being done wrong to them. They don't have problems or stop loving the adults in their life because they're dependent on the adults in their life. And so what happens is actually a psychology starts to develop, a story starts to develop that tells them that they're unlovable or that they're doing something wrong. And the fear and that alarm or threat response that's going to go off in them usually directs traffic to self-critical thinking, usually directs traffic in adulthood to patterns of behavior where they are trying to be the one that's the fixer or to make up for it or control the situation in some way. And so these are traditionally what we call in psychology fawning responses. And it makes a ton of sense, right? So what will happen in the nervous system, let me give you a little lesson on the nervous system, is it has kind of 3 layers to it. That autonomic nervous system response that happens to us in our interpersonal relationships, whether we feel the threat of abandonment or betrayal coming on. If we're not feeling secure, that's the first layer. If we're not feeling that secure way, then the middle part of it is fight or flight. It traditionally is what we call that, right? It's an alarm system that goes off and there's a threat and we have the ability to mobilize ourselves to try to get rid of that threat. That's what that middle layer is all about. But the bottom layer is different. The bottom layer is there's a threat and we fall, like we collapse and don't feel like there is any way to fix it. And yet, if you're sustainably in that phase, right, like you are a 0 to 7-year-old who isn't going to fight their way out of or flee from your family of origin that's not giving you the needs that you need, and may even be representing, something that feels like an abandonment and betrayal routinely, and so you're threatened routinely, then what you learn to do is fawn. And fawning is this it's one of the cornerstones of it is that people are absolutely petrified of conflict because immediately they assume the conflict was created because it's their fault. So they have kind of this hate relationship, just hate relationship with conflict because every time things feel uncomfortable, they feel like conflict, and everything that feels like conflict feels like they did something wrong and they have to switch it out. So what they want to do is like not move and stay small and be in the corner and not make any ripples in their life or in their worlds because they don't want to create that conflict, because they don't want to be wrong and they don't want to have to fix it. Okay, so that's an aspect of it. The other aspect of it then is, how can I prevent that from ever happening? Because they do have some action behaviors that they engage in, but they're in this phase of, they're not in the heat of the threat, so they're not feeling abandoned per se in that moment, but they're trying to prevent any future occurrence of feeling abandoned or feeling betrayed in their relationship. So what they're ending up doing is scanning their environments all the time for ways in which to please the others in their life, so there never is any conflict. It's almost like they have this anticipatory conflict fear, and they're continually acting in the capacity of taking care of other people's needs, reducing any potential for conflict, worrying about the 5,000 ways things can go wrong, and trying to problem solve how they're going to fix that before it ever happens. That's a pretty common response. Now, I even see it for people who, had what I would call complex trauma. So it isn't just one event or kind of one set of relationships that created that in age 0 to 7, but even got repeated later in their life, between 7 and 12, and between like 12 and 18, and 18 and 24. And, by that time, the brain is where it can be structurally as an adult, other than the fact that it's constantly kind of reinventing, and we're making new connections and building new cells, but it's kind of a fully developed brain at about 24 to 26. So even those folks that have had multiple might anchor back to that fawning response if the first blueprint really was, all I can do is duck and stay small and hope that conflict won't come my way. Or, man, if I get smart, I'll learn ways to try and prevent any conflict from ever happening. And that's a painful place to come from, especially if it's happening unconsciously, especially if you're not really aware that you do this. And it's a painful place to come from because it'll be equal parts work for you, and one of the ways that you're feeling better. When you are doing this conflict avoidance thing and trying to people please and prevent that any bad thing will ever happen. And just listen to that sentence: prevent any bad thing from ever happening. That's not rational. It's not realistic, right? We're human, and mistakes happen, and natural disasters happen, life happens, and disappointments happen. So the premise is very childlike. Like, I'll just prevent it from ever being bad. It'll just all be good. It'll all be good. It'll be peaceful and content. Yeah. No, honey. Like, if you're 0 to 7, I can comfort you around that, but they didn't get comforted around that. And in fact, some of the behaviors that were fawning behaviors, appeared like overachievement, or appeared like being a caretaker, or appeared like a people pleaser, and people liked it and they got reinforced. And so there's this other complicating factor once you get into adulthood where, like, you're getting reinforced for doing some of these things. Eek. That's a real hard pattern to break. I mean, honestly, if this is you in any way, I'm just going to disclaim right here, go get some therapy. Most therapists can help you to unpack this, but there are also therapists like myself that are really specializing in these kind of areas. Go get some therapy, because that really is something you need to be assisted on the journey of remapping for yourself and creating a new pattern of behavior. So, okay, 0 to 7. Let's just say these bad things didn't happen until between 7 and 14. Maybe it's like once you got to school, right? Maybe you were in school somehow bullied, or odd man out, right? Never in the popular crowds, or never had a crowd, and always just kind of felt like you were on the odd man out. Now, the last week I talked about the person that's insecure. People in this 7 to 12 range might fall into that, right? And the interesting thing about between 7 and 12 is your brain is starting to develop from what we call concrete thinking into abstract thinking. And what that means is being able to go from black and white, like, these are the right things to do and here are the not right things to do. That's what little kids think. into kind of more of those grays. So like, ooh, there's right and not right. And then there's context that makes this kind of rightish and not rightish, right? So like that's one of the places where the brain is changing the most. And the other place where the brain is changing the most is early, which I didn't mention. Early in our brain, we have a lot of what we call mirror neurons. Neurons are the cells that make up the brain. There's billions and billions of them, trillions. I can't remember now. That sounds awful, but yeah, there's a lot. With all of those brain cells, there are a lot of mirror neurons early on. And the reason for that is the brain is like in this hyper learning phase early on. It's learning how to walk and learning how to talk and learning how to see and learning how to taste and learning how to hear and learning every single day. And so it has a lot of mirror neurons because mirror neurons do this thing where they, their senses, the five senses go out into the environment, experience something, and then go, hey, let me replicate that on the inside. And so literally, like I see my mom get up and walk like a biped. And now I have in my brain a map of biped walking. Now I'm just crawling, but I have a map on the inside for that. So here's another interesting thing about that 0 to 7 age is if you didn't have a map for something like how to create relationships well, you just don't got it by the time you get to 7 to 12, right? Now you still may pick it up. This is the beauty of the what we call neuroplasticity in the brain, that the brain is constantly growing. But now between 7 and 12, those mirror neurons start to not be the predominant neuron by the time you get to that 12-ish range. And in part, it's in this development in the frontal lobe of more reasoning, more executive functioning, more ability to problem solve and see different sides of things. And that's that abstract way of thinking. Metacognition starts to come online. The ability to think about our thinking. Like that's the crazy thing that humans can do is like we can step back and look at ourselves like machines, like neural networks, and ask questions. As far as we know, the apes do not do that, right? They're experiential in nature and kind of tied to their five senses, but we still have a little bit more on that frontal lobe, and that allows us to kind of take that one step back and think about our thinking. So in that 7 to 12 range, resources are better. They definitely are. And protective factors might be in place by that time. There might be many safe adults. There could be teachers and coaches and, ministers and neighbors and parents of friends and all of those things. So, the resources are more there. The protective factors are more there. The internal ability to manage things might be there. We might have gotten some great maps, between 0 and 7. So, hey, A-okay. Now we're in a better space. Great. And even there, something could happen, like bullying, right? Something could happen. We feel in the outs. And here is where the responses are a little bit more diversified, is what I would describe it as. So now I'm looking for, do you stay more in that middle layer? Remember, I talked about safe, secure. That's the first layer. That middle layer is fight or flight. So these are actions where I see you trying to forcibly get the threat to go away. You're either fighting it, you're on that side of the affect spectrum. So anything from irritability, frustration, anger to rage, right? And all the variations in between. Or you're on the, worried, apprehensive, scared, fearful, panicked, that side of the range, right? And you're doing things that are trying to get away from those feeling states. You're trying to change your environment not to have the things happening. So in this range, like I'm talking to you about it and I'm thinking, okay, if your predominant way of managing these things in your life is to get into that irritable or anxious state, then I'm guessing that the significance of that trauma happened in that 7 to 12 range. And I'm guessing that, that's how you found yourself in a little bit more resource state to manage it. You're not just fawning. You might also do some fawning. And there is certainly people who have kind of a mixture of both. The reason why people fall into fawning and stick there usually happens between 0 and 7. The reason why I believe that to be true is that that's a pretty profound, I would call the foundation where the scaffolding of all of these other responses are going to show up in your autonomic nervous system. So your fight flight system, your fawn freeze is really going to be a stronger pull for you if this insult to injury happened earlier in your life, right? So then 12 to 18, even more resourced. Even more resourced. But there's another unique element that shows up. So folks in this range, if they've had some interpersonal traumas in their life, they lean into their social crowd. So one of the resources that worked or maybe didn't work for them is who was around them and who was able to kind of catch them when they fell, per se. So feeling like they belonged somewhere was really important. And, any of the groups that we belong to can have positives and negatives for us, but certainly, it depends on kind of what crowd you leaned into. Because if it was a crowd that was damaging for you, then that's going to be also further impairing. So then 18 and beyond, that I'm looking at a much more developed, fully developed and resourced ability to manage if a big interpersonal trauma happens. So something like a grief, right? Like maybe a relationship with a romantic partner early in your life, and that person, left unannounced or, damaged the relationship in some way. And or even just, died. I mean, like that loss is significant, right? So people are way more resourced once they get to that age. And so there's a lot more diversity in what they are impaired in and aren't impaired in, right? I might have you come into my office and there's this one place in your relationships where you're still struggling and feel stuck, but most of them, like you've got your wits about you and are able to handle. So depends on when this happened, right, in your life, how much you have to give to me as far as resources at the start and where we have to build from. I would say, honestly, go to therapy if ever you feel in this stuck place. But what I want you to be aware of is there are neurobiological reasons why you do get attracted to these folks. And depending on how early it was, how strongly that compulsion towards that group of people is. And usually part of what's happening is where your nervous system is at in all of the relationships. So if you're that 0 to 7-year-old that was harmed or had, emotional neglect or just an immature parent that wasn't able to give you your needs the way that you needed, then you may see yourself really strongly having these relationships repeatedly. Unfortunately, right? You may find yourself stuck in those relationships over and over and over again because the fawning response is in that basement level of being immobilized to do anything really for yourself and threatened. The only thing you can do is your fawning. That is the only map in your brain. And so you need therapy mostly to help you rebuild, mostly to help you reconnect some new neural networks. And as we start that, it feels like building, dirt roads, dirt paths, maybe even just grass bent paths, when the interstate is conflict avoidance, stay small, try to duck and run, don't make any waves. Yeah. And I'm going to be asking you to do something that feels really honestly threatening to you. You need somebody to help navigate you through that. Let me just be honest with you. Even in the 7 to 12 range, if you get hyperreactive angrily or anxiously, and you can't calm the nervous system long enough for you to figure out, is there another way through this and be creative and turn that creative mind on. If you're in survival mode, your creative brain can't work. So you too should really think about talking to somebody to kind of guide you through that process. And then if you're somebody who, more of that, there's more diversity, there's more resource available because you were more adult as it happened, but you still have some pretty ways of dealing with it. Like you fell into a crowd of people that drank a lot and partied a lot. And so every time you're not getting your needs met in your relationships, you're drinking and partying, and you're 40, probably not working for you anymore. You might even have an addiction at this point, and you need to address that, right? So if the only way that you knew how to get your needs met is to get affirmed by a social group that's not so great for you, you still might need assistance in pulling yourself through that, because there might be other complicated factors such as addiction that are holding you in to those groups. And addiction is broad, my friends, because it's a dopaminergic. So dopamine is the neurochemical that kind of gives us pleasure, gives us motivation, what contributes towards our drives. I think that what is so fascinating is it's not just alcohol, it's not just drugs that create an addiction. Gaming, right, is an addiction. Looking on social media is an addiction. Shopping is an addiction. Gambling. There are so many ways in which we kind of get into an impaired way of interfacing with a behavior. Eating is an addiction, if it can be. I mean, not all of us are addicted to it, obviously, but these are like, there's a way to make an addiction out of just about anything, because the dopamine is what creates the addiction, and that's in us. So it just, how does the thing that we're doing on the outside kind of create that addictive quality in the dopaminergic system is really what's the problem, and you would need assistance for that. And then for those of you where it happened a little bit later in life, but it was traumatic, and you maybe haven't reintegrated that story of what happened to you traumatically into the bigger idea of who you are as a person in this world, well, that could use a little help with it too. I think if what's happening to you is that every time you then subsequently try to go into a relationship, you have a threat response, you're going to be in survival mode in relationships. Well, that's not going to work for you to build healthy, sustainable relationships. So you might not be necessarily attracting the bad people to you, but because you're in survival mode, your brain isn't fully online, isn't fully seeing all the red flags. And so there might be some truth to that. Like if your trauma of I got dumped, and where I found out that the guy slept with 15 people, like that's tough. That's tough stuff early in our, between 18 and 24, 26. Those are horrible stories to have to come out of and then try to establish healthy boundaries in relationships. So if that's you, if it was even like a date sexual assault, oftentimes those are the age ranges where that stuff's happening, because you're also probably and somehow incapacitated by drugs or alcohol or things that are happening at the same time that you're doing these other things. Like, we know this to be true. These are statistics. These are just hard facts, my friends. If that happened to you and you haven't reintegrated that into your bigger sense of self, you've got a great family history. You didn't have any family trauma. Like my parents were great. I had a secure attachment growing up, but that happened in that age range. What you need is a therapist that can help you integrate that back into the storyline of the bigger you, so that you aren't in survival mode in every time that you go into a relationship. Because if you are in survival mode every time you go in a relationship, you're going to miss the red flags. When you are in the middle of a savanna, scared because you heard rustling in the grass and think it's a lioness, you're not thinking about red flags. You're thinking about getting the hell out of there. And that's literally the alarm system in your body that's going off in relationships if you haven't reintegrated that really horrible experience into your bigger understanding of yourself and your world. So that's why I wanted to have this podcast today. I just wanted to kind of peel apart. It's not all that simple, right? And so this idea of, am I attracting these people? There's a lot of different ways that comes at me as a question. And I just, I thought it'd be a great way to start this podcast series, because it certainly is one that comes up quite often. Ironically, I'm a trauma therapist, not a relationship therapist, but I'm an interpersonal and relational trauma therapist. And so it was one of the things that I thought would be a good way to kick off this series. Just so you know, anytime that you're listening to these podcasts and you're thinking, I really wish you'd say more about this, or gosh, that makes me wonder about this, send me a comment, write a review, let me know what you want to hear about, because I want to hear from you and I want to be able to give you what you want to hear about. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I need to be sure that you understand This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and it is not a replacement for any mental health or medical therapy, counseling, or other treatments. I also want to be sure that if you are in crisis, that you seek out help. So I'm going to share with you here 2 different resources that you might use for yourself or someone else you know that's close to you in crisis. The first is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can find them at suicidepreventionlifeline.org online, or pick up the phone and dial 988. And you can talk to somebody right away if you're in crisis. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't like to pick up the phone to talk to somebody directly, there is also a crisis text line. You can find them at crisistextline.org online, or you can text HOME to 741-741, and you'll reach somebody right away to help you in crisis. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and I strongly encourage that you like and follow us wherever you find your podcasts. Share us if you like an episode and think somebody could use that information, and certainly leave a review if you feel like there's something that really resonated for you. It helps me when I see those reviews to make sure to have relevant material on the podcast that you want to hear about.